The letter was dated the 4th of March, and it smelled of lavender water and a hand that had pressed too hard into the page. Lottie Vass noticed these things because she noticed everything: the weight of paper, the slant of ink, the way a man's correspondence could tell you more about him than a year of his conversation. She had been pressing shirts in the Duke of Fenwick's dressing room for 2 years now, and in that time she had read perhaps 300 letters that he had left folded in breast pockets, crumpled in waistcoat linings, tucked carelessly between collar stays as though the written word were no more significant than a spare button. He never checked. He never thought to. A maid who pressed shirts was, to a man like Rowan Sinclair, as invisible as the iron itself, a function, not a person. She arrived at 6:30 each morning, when the dressing room was still cold and the light through the tall window was the color of pewter. She built up the fire in the hearth and set 2 flatirons on the grate to heat while she laid out the pressing cloth on the broad oak table. The Duke's shirts hung in the wardrobe in order: white cambric for daily wear, finer linen for evenings, lawn for formal occasions. She knew each one by weight and weave. She lifted them, she heated the iron, she smoothed the creases until the fabric lay flat and perfect, and if a letter fell from a pocket, she set it on the dressing table without comment. That was what he believed. That was what he had always believed. What he did not know, what no one in Fenwick House knew except Greer, who had known from the beginning and said nothing, because Greer understood that silence was sometimes the greatest kindness one could offer, was that Lottie read every word, not out of malice, not to gather secrets she might later trade. She read because she was the kind of woman who could not leave a sentence unfinished, a page unturned, a question unanswered. She had taught herself to read at 9 years old, sitting in the scullery of a vicarage in Shropshire, where her mother had scrubbed floors, tracing the shapes of letters in spilled flour until they became words, and the words became sentences, and the sentences became a door that opened onto a world so vast and particular that she could never close it again. Her mother had not disapproved exactly, but she had not encouraged it either. Reading was not a skill that bought bread or kept a position. Reading was a luxury for people who did not work with their hands, and Lottie's mother, who had worked with her hands since the age of 11, saw the danger in a daughter who wanted things she could not have. But Lottie read anyway, in stolen minutes, by firelight, by the gray dawn light that came through the scullery window before the household woke. By 12, she was reading the vicar's sermons before he delivered them and finding the weak arguments in his logic. By 15, she had found a Latin primer abandoned in a hedgerow, water-damaged, missing its final pages, and taught herself enough to read the inscriptions on monuments and the marginalia in old books that the vicar kept in a glass-fronted case she was meant to dust but never open. She opened it every time. By the time she arrived at Fenwick House at 20, she was better read than half the gentlemen who dined at the Duke's table, and none of them would ever know it, because none of them would ever think to ask. The March letter was from Lady Ashton. Lottie knew Lady Ashton's hand as well as she knew the Duke's own. The correspondence had been arriving for the better part of 18 months, not frequently, but with a regularity that suggested something deeper than social obligation. Lady Ashton wrote with intelligence and a kind of restrained warmth that made Lottie think she was a woman who had learned to feel deeply and express herself carefully, as though every sentence were a door she opened only halfway. The Duke's replies, which Lottie never saw completed, only in draft, scratched out and rewritten on the blotter he never cleared, were shorter, more guarded, and occasionally tender in a way that surprised her. He was not a tender man in his household. He was civil, distant, precise. He spoke to his steward Maddox with efficiency, to Mrs. Crane, the housekeeper, with courtesy, and to Lottie not at all. She unfolded the March letter with the same careful hands she used for everything, pressing the creases flat against the dressing table, reading quickly because she had perhaps 4 minutes before the second iron heated and her absence from rhythm would be noticed. "My dear Rowan," the letter began. Lottie had learned months ago that Lady Ashton still addressed him by his Christian name, though whatever had existed between them appeared to have ended before Lottie's arrival at Fenwick House. The tone of the letters was not that of a current lover. It was something more complicated, a woman who had once been essential to him and now occupied a strange, honest, unresolved space in his life. They wrote to each other as people do who have shared something they cannot name and cannot entirely release. The letter was not about affection. It was about money. Lady Ashton's brother, it seemed, had accrued debts, significant ones, tied to a venture that had collapsed. He had borrowed against expectations that had not materialized, and now creditors were circling. Lady Ashton was not asking the Duke for funds. She was warning him. Her brother had, in desperation, forged a letter of guarantee bearing what he claimed was the Duke of Fenwick's seal, a document that purported to underwrite the debts with the Duke's personal assurance. Lottie read the passage twice, then a third time. The forgery, if presented to the right creditor and accepted as genuine, would create an obligation that could entangle the Duke's estate in litigation for years. Lady Ashton wrote that she had only discovered this that morning. She did not know whether the document had already been submitted. She urged him to act quickly, to consult his solicitor, to write to the creditors directly, to make clear that no such guarantee existed. The iron was ready. Lottie folded the letter along its original creases, placed it on the dressing table beside the Duke's watch and his House of Lords summons. He was sitting that week, something about corn levies, and returned to her work. The shirt beneath her hands was white cambric, fine woven, still warm from the previous pass. She pressed it with the same steady rhythm she always used. Her hands did not shake. They never did. But her mind was already working. She knew, because she had read his correspondence for 2 years, that the Duke was leaving for his northern estate the following morning. A 3-day journey. He would not read the letter before he left. She had observed his habits long enough to know that he checked his dressing table in the evenings, not the mornings, and tonight he was dining at Lord Pemberton's. He would return late. He would not enter his dressing room until his valet laid out his traveling clothes before dawn, and by then the letter would be buried beneath whatever else accumulated on the surface overnight. He might not read it for a week. A week was too long. Lottie knew this because she had read a separate letter 3 months prior from the Duke's solicitor, Mr. Arden, regarding the very venture Lady Ashton's brother had invested in. The solicitor had mentioned the brother by name. The debts were real. The desperation was real. And if a forged guarantee reached the creditors before the Duke could repudiate it, the legal entanglement would be precisely as catastrophic as Lady Ashton feared. She finished the shirt. She hung it in the wardrobe. She collected the pressing cloth and the cooled iron and carried them downstairs to the servants' hall, where the day's work continued as it always did, steady, invisible, essential. That night, Lottie did something she had never done in 2 years of service. She went to the library. She had been in the library before, of course. She cleaned it on Tuesdays and Fridays, dusting the shelves with a cloth that smelled of beeswax, straightening volumes that the Duke displaced in his reading, emptying the grate. But she had never gone there for herself. She had wanted to. God, how she had wanted to. But the risk was too great. A maid found reading in the master's library was a maid dismissed without character, and Lottie could not afford dismissal. She had no family to return to. She had no savings worth mentioning. She had only this position, this house, these shirts, and the stolen minutes of reading that the Duke's carelessness with his letters afforded her. But tonight was different. Tonight, she needed to find something specific. The library at Fenwick House was not large by ducal standards, but it was serious, a working collection, not a decorative one. The Duke read widely in history, political economy, and natural philosophy. His shelves held Blackstone's commentaries, Smith's Wealth of Nations, Burke and Payne side by side, and a full run of parliamentary reports bound in calf. Lottie moved through the room by candlelight, a single taper carried carefully, wax dripping onto her wrist, until she found what she was looking for, the Duke's correspondence ledger. It was not locked. Why would it be? No one in the household would think to read it. No one in the household could read it, except Lottie. She opened the ledger and turned to the most recent entries. The Duke kept a meticulous record of outgoing letters, date, recipient, subject, whether a reply was expected. She found his last letter to Mr. Arden, dated February, subject noted simply as Garrett Venture, exposure query. She found 3 letters to Lady Ashton across the previous 6 months. She found what she needed most, a letter sent to Lord Sefton, one of the creditors Lady Ashton's brother owed, dated January, regarding an entirely unrelated matter of agricultural leases. The Duke knew Lord Sefton. He could write to him directly. He could repudiate the forged guarantee before it was presented, if only he read the letter in time. Lottie closed the ledger. She replaced it exactly as she had found it. She blew out the candle. She was standing in the dark, the smell of extinguished tallow sharp in the air when she heard the door open. The Duke of Fenwick stood in the doorway with a lamp in his hand. No, a candelabra, 3 flames, held high enough to flood the entrance with light. He was still dressed for dinner. His dark navy tailcoat was unbuttoned, his white cravat loosened at the throat, and there was the faint smell of cigar smoke and port that clung to men who had spent 3 hours at another man's table. He looked as though he had come to retrieve a book before bed, which was precisely what he had done, and he was looking at Lottie with an expression she had never seen directed at her in 2 years of pressing his shirts. He was seeing her, not the function of her, not the apron, not the pressing cloth, not the clean shirts hanging in his wardrobe each morning as though they had pressed themselves. He was seeing a woman standing among his books in the dark with candle wax on her fingers, and for the first time in 2 years, his eyes registered her as a person who existed independently of his needs. "Who is there?" he said, not alarmed, not angry, curious, which was somehow worse. "Lottie Vass, your grace, the housemaid." A pause. The candelabra shifted. Light moved across the spines of books, across the leather chair by the hearth, across Lottie's face. She was wearing her plain dark wool dress, her white apron still tied from the evening's work, her hair pinned beneath her cap. She looked exactly like what she was, except that she was standing in his library at 11 o'clock at night with the residue of candle wax on her fingers and an expression that was not afraid. "The housemaid," he repeated. "What are you doing in my library at this hour?" She had prepared nothing. She had no excuse rehearsed, no plausible reason that a maid would be standing alone among his books in the dark. She could say she had come to check the grate. She could say she had heard a noise. She could lie, and he would believe her, because he had no framework for imagining that a woman in a white apron might have come here to read. Lottie did not lie. "I was reading, your grace." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. She watched him process the sentence, watched it collide with every assumption he had ever made about the people who moved through his house, who pressed his shirts, who emptied his grates and carried his bathwater, and existed at the periphery of his vision like furniture that breathed. "You can read," he said. It was not a question, but it was not yet a belief either. It was a sentence spoken by a man who was testing the weight of something he had not expected to hold. "Yes, your grace. English and Latin, some French, though my pronunciation is poor." He set the candelabra down on the table beside the door. The light steadied. He looked at her with the full attention of a man who sat in the House of Lords and debated policy with the sharpest minds in England, and she did not look away. "You taught yourself?" "Yes." "How long have you been reading in this room?" "Tonight is the first time I have come here for myself. I have wanted to for 2 years. I did not dare until tonight." What changed tonight? And there it was, the question she had known would come, the question that would require her to reveal either everything or nothing. She could retreat now. She could say she had simply found courage, or that the evening was long and she could not sleep, and he would accept it, because it was easier than the truth. But Lottie had spent 2 years pressing this man's shirts and reading his private correspondence and understanding him better than anyone in this house, possibly better than anyone alive, and she was tired of being invisible to a man whose mind she had come to respect. "There is a letter on your dressing table," she said, "from Lady Ashton. It arrived this morning in the pocket of your gray waistcoat. You did not read it. You are leaving for the north tomorrow, and you will not read it before you go. It cannot wait." The Duke's face changed. It was not anger, not yet. It was the particular stillness of a man who has just been told that the walls of his house have been listening. "You read my letters. They fall from your pockets when I press your shirts. I set them on the dressing table. But yes, I read them first. I've read them for 2 years. She said it without apology, without defiance. With the same composure she brought to every task, steady hands, clear eyes, a voice that did not waver because wavering would be dishonest, and Lottie Vass was incapable of dishonesty even when it would have served her. She could see the calculations moving behind his eyes, the letters she had read, the private thoughts she had held, the dealings and doubts and half-finished drafts that he had assumed were seen by no one. 2 years of a man's interior life, laid bare to a woman he had never once addressed by name. "Every letter," he said. "Every letter you left in a pocket. Yes, the drafts on your blotter as well, when they were legible." His jaw tightened. She watched a muscle move beneath the skin of his cheek, a small, involuntary thing, the kind of detail she had learned to read in the same way she read letters, carefully, completely, without flinching from what they revealed. "Including the letters from Lady Ashton." "Yes." He sat down, not in the leather chair by the hearth, in the straight-backed chair by the writing desk, the one he used for correspondence. He sat as though his legs had made the decision without consulting him. The candelabra threw his shadow long across the bookshelves. "What does the letter say?" Lottie told him. She told him about the forged guarantee, about Lady Ashton's brother, about the creditors, about Lord Sefton. She told him what she had found in the correspondence ledger, the January letter to Sefton, the February letter to Mr. Arden. She laid it out with the precision of a solicitor's clerk and the calm of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation without knowing it for 2 years. She did not embellish. She did not speculate beyond what the letters confirmed. She presented facts in the order they mattered, and she watched the Duke's expression shift from disbelief to attention to something that looked, in the candlelight, like a man reassessing the structural integrity of everything he had assumed about the world beneath his own roof. When she finished, the Duke said nothing for a long time. The candles hissed. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the quarter hour. The fire in the library hearth had burned low, and the room was cooling, and neither of them moved to tend it. "You understood all of this," he said finally. "The financial implications, the legal exposure, the forgery." "Yes, Your Grace. From reading my letters. From reading your letters and your ledger and the books on your shelves when I dusted them. I read slowly, but I read everything I can reach." He stood. He walked to the shelf nearest the window and pulled a volume at random. He opened it and held it out to her. "Read." Lottie took the volume. It was a report on the Corn Laws, dense with economic argument and procedural language. She read aloud for perhaps 2 minutes, clearly without hesitation, with the ease of someone who had been reading complex prose since before she could afford a candle to read by. The Duke took the book back. He returned it to the shelf. "You should have told me," he said. "I am a housemaid, Your Grace. You did not ask." "I should have asked." "No one asks." The Duke left the library. Lottie heard his footsteps on the stairs, quick, purposeful, ascending to his dressing room. She knew he was going to read the letter. She knew he would act on it. She blew out the candelabra he had left behind, because he would not think to, and returned to the servants' quarters. Mrs. Crane was waiting in the corridor outside the kitchen, her shawl drawn tight across her shoulders, her expression the particular blend of concern and resignation that housekeepers perfected through decades of managing houses that were never their own. "You were in the library," Mrs. Crane said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Lottie, if he dismisses you, he will not dismiss me tonight. He has a forgery to deal with first." Mrs. Crane stared at her. Then she nodded, slowly, and went to bed. The Duke did not leave for the north the next morning. He sent for Mr. Arden instead. By midday, a letter had been dispatched to Lord Sefton repudiating any guarantee bearing the Fenwick seal. By evening, a second letter had gone to Lady Ashton, the contents of which Lottie did not read, because it was sealed and sent before it ever touched a waistcoat pocket. 3 days passed. Lottie pressed shirts. She emptied grates. She dusted the library on Tuesday, as she always did, running her cloth along the spines of books she now knew the Duke had seen her read, touching the ledger she had opened without permission, straightening the chair he had sat in when the weight of her revelation had taken his legs from under him. The Duke was in his study with Maddox for most of the day, and she heard fragments of conversation through the door, solicitor, creditors, Sefton's reply, the brothers' whereabouts. But she did not linger. She had said what needed saying. The rest was his to manage. She noticed, though, that the household had shifted in some imperceptible way. Mrs. Crane looked at her differently, not with suspicion, but with watchful tenderness, as though monitoring a situation whose outcome she could not predict but deeply cared about. Maddox, who had always been cordial in the clipped manner of a steward who respected boundaries, now seemed to study her when she passed through the hall. And Greer caught her eye one morning across the servants' hall and gave her the smallest nod, the kind that meant, "I told you so, and I am glad in equal measure." On the 4th day, Greer found her in the servants' hall, polishing candlesticks. "He wants to see you," Greer said. The butler's face was unreadable, but his eyes were not. There was something in them that looked to Lottie like relief. "In the library." "Now?" "Now." She set down the candlestick. She untied her apron, an instinct, nothing more, and then retied it, because she was a housemaid, and she would present herself as one. The Duke was standing by the window when she entered. The library looked different in the afternoon light, silvery, expansive, the spines of books catching pale sun through the glass. He turned when she entered, and this time he did not look surprised to see her. He looked as though he had been thinking about her for 4 days, and had only now arrived at a conclusion. The guarantee has been repudiated, he said. Sefton confirmed he had not yet received the forged document. Arden has advised that the matter is contained. Lady Ashton's brother has been confronted and has confessed. I am glad, Your Grace. You saved my estate a considerable entanglement. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. She had not done it for gratitude. Sit down, the Duke said. I would prefer to stand, Your Grace. Then I shall stand as well. He moved away from the window. I've been thinking about what you told me, about reading my letters, about the ledger, about the books. Yes, Your Grace. I have also been thinking about the fact that for 2 years, a woman capable of reading Latin, understanding financial instruments, and identifying a legal threat to my estate has been pressing my shirts, and I did not know. I did not think to know. I did not consider the possibility. He paused. Lottie waited. She had learned patience from 2 years of pressing shirts for a man who did not see her. A few more seconds cost her nothing. That is a failure of observation, the Duke said, and I do not tolerate failure of observation in myself. It is not a personal failure, Your Grace. It is how the world is arranged. You see what you are taught to see. You were not taught to see me. No, he said, but I am seeing you now. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who were meeting for the first time, despite having occupied the same house for 2 years, she knowing everything about him, he knowing nothing about her, and both of them understanding that the imbalance had just shifted. What do you want? He asked. Not what you think I will offer. What do you actually want? Lottie looked at the bookshelves. She looked at them the way other women might look at a ballroom or a jewelry case or a fine house on a fashionable street, with hunger and longing and the particular ache of wanting something that has been close enough to touch, but never close enough to hold. Access, she said, to the library, properly, not while dusting. The Duke studied her face. Whatever he found there, and Lottie suspected it was the absence of performance, the total lack of any attempt to charm or plead or diminish herself, seemed to settle something in him. You shall have it, he said, and more than that, if you are willing. He explained. His correspondence had grown unmanageable, not the volume, but the complexity. Letters from solicitors, from stewards of his other properties, from political associates whose arguments required careful reading and precise replies. Maddox was competent with accounts, but struggled with legal language. The Duke needed someone who could read carefully, summarize accurately, and flag matters of urgency. You are describing a secretary, Lottie said. I am describing what you have already been doing, without title, without compensation, and without my knowledge. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and it was honest in a way that cost him something, an admission not merely of her capability, but of his own blindness. He was not a man who made such admissions lightly. She had read enough of his letters to know that. She did not accept immediately. She told him she would consider it, which surprised him. She could see that, because he was not accustomed to offers being weighed rather than seized. He was the Duke of Fenwick. Men sought his patronage, his approval, his attention. The idea that a housemaid might receive his offer and ask for time to think was an experience entirely without precedent in his life. But Lottie had learned from 2 years of reading the letters of a man who had once loved a woman he could not keep and managed an estate he sometimes resented, that decisions made quickly were decisions made poorly. She accepted the following morning. She found him in the library. He had been there since dawn, she learned later, waiting, though he would never have described it that way, and told him simply that she was willing, on the condition that she continued to eat in the servants' hall and keep her own hours. He agreed without argument, which told her everything she needed to know about how badly he wanted this arrangement to work. By the end of the month, she had moved from the servants' quarters to a small room adjoining the library, still modest, still a servant's room in dimension, but lined with shelves that the Duke had ordered installed at her request. She filled them within a week from the Duke's own collection, volumes he had not opened in years, which she read in the evenings by candlelight, with the concentration of a woman making up for 2 decades of deprivation. Greer, carrying her trunk upstairs on the day she moved, paused at the door and said very quietly, "It is about time, Miss Vass." And Lottie, who did not cry easily, felt something hot and unexpected behind her eyes. The household adjusted. Mrs. Crane managed the transition with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had navigated far stranger arrangements in great houses. Maddox was wary at first. A maid elevated above her station, handling correspondence that had been his adjacent territory. But within a fortnight, he had begun consulting her on matters of language, and within a month, he deferred to her judgment on anything involving legal text. The other servants watched and whispered, as servants always did, but the whispers faded when they saw that Lottie carried herself no differently than she ever had. She still tied her own apron. She still ate in the servants' hall. She simply also spent her mornings in the library, reading the Duke's letters properly, at a desk, by daylight, with his knowledge and at his request. What changed between them happened slowly, as real things always do. The Duke began consulting her not just on correspondence, but on decisions, whether to support a particular motion in the Lords, whether to invest in a canal scheme, whether a tenant's request for a reduced rent was genuine hardship or opportunism. He discovered that Lottie's intelligence was not merely the ability to decode words on a page, but the ability to understand what the words meant beneath their surface, the anxieties they concealed, the leverage they sought, the human need that drove every piece of formal language. He discovered, too, that she was the only person in his life who did not perform for him. She did not flatter. She did not defer beyond what civility required. When he was wrong, she said so, not with the careful diplomacy of a steward protecting his position, but with the plain clarity of a woman who respected him enough to disagree. He found this infuriating. He also found it essential. The letters from Lady Ashton continued, though less frequently. Lottie read them still, now openly as part of her duties, and one evening, setting a reply on his desk for signature, she said, "She writes to you as someone who has accepted what she lost. You might consider doing the same." The Duke looked up from the letter. He looked at Lottie. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horizon he has only just realized is there. "I believe I already have," he said. They were married in the chapel at Fenwick House on a Tuesday in September, with Greer standing witness and Mrs. Crane weeping into a handkerchief she had pressed herself. The chapel was small, stone-floored, cold even in summer, with a window of plain glass that let in the morning light uncolored and honest. Lottie wore a gown of pale ivory muslin with a high empire waist and delicate embroidery at the hem, the first garment she had ever owned that was not wool or cotton, and she touched the fabric repeatedly throughout the ceremony, as though confirming it was real. The Duke wore his dark navy tailcoat, the same one he had been wearing the night he found her in the library, and whether this was deliberate or coincidence Lottie never asked, because some things were better left as mysteries. Maddox stood at the back of the chapel with his hands clasped behind his back and nodded once when the vows were spoken, which from Maddox was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The ton was, predictably, appalled. A housemaid, a woman with no family, no fortune, no connections, no entry in any register of eligible women anywhere in England. The Duke of Fenwick had lost his mind, or been bewitched, or been blackmailed. The rumors multiplied like candle flames in a mirrored room. Lord Sefton, who knew better than anyone what the Duke's former housemaid had done for his estate, said nothing, which was its own kind of endorsement. Lottie was aware of all the talk and concerned by none. She had spent 2 years reading the private thoughts of London's most powerful men through their careless correspondence, and she knew precisely how small their opinions were when stripped of the status that inflated them. Lady Ashton wrote one final letter, brief, warm, entirely without resentment. It said simply that she was glad he had found someone who saw him clearly, because that was the one thing she had never quite managed to do. Lottie read it at the breakfast table, passed it to Rowan, and said, "She is a good woman." He agreed. 7 years later, the library at Fenwick House had doubled in size. Rowan had commissioned an extension, a bright south-facing room with tall windows and deep shelves and a writing desk that he had built for Lottie by the same craftsman who made furniture for the great houses of Mayfair. The desk was mahogany, broad enough to hold 3 open volumes simultaneously, and she valued it less for its cost than for what it represented. A man who had once left his letters in his pockets for a woman he could not see, now building her a place so that she might read in comfort for the rest of her life. Their children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3, spent their mornings there, the boy already reading simple texts with the focused attention that reminded Lottie of herself at that age, the girl chewing contentedly on the corner of a Latin primer that Lottie had found in a Shropshire hedgerow 20 years ago and kept as though it were made of gold. Greer, now elderly and largely retired, but unwilling to leave the house he had served for 40 years, could sometimes be found in the library in the afternoons, sitting in the leather chair by the hearth, watching Lottie work at her desk with an expression that suggested he had known, always, that this was where she belonged. Maddox still managed the estate with the same quiet competence, though he now consulted the Duchess, for that was what she was and what she had always been in everything but name, on every matter of significance. Mrs. Crane had retired to a cottage on the estate, a gift from the Duke, and came to the house every Sunday for dinner, sitting at the table with the family as though she had always been there. Rowan Sinclair, Duke of Fenwick, still left letters in his pockets. He did it deliberately now, small notes folded into shirt linings and waistcoat seams that said things he found easier to write than to speak. Lottie found them when she pressed nothing at all, because she had not pressed a shirt in 7 years, but she checked his pockets every morning out of habit, and he filled them out of love. On a cool September evening, the anniversary of their wedding, Lottie sat at her desk in the library with the children asleep upstairs and the candles burning low and a letter in her hand, not from a pocket, but from Lady Ashton's niece, a girl of 16 who had written to ask whether the Duchess of Fenwick might recommend books for a young woman who wished to educate herself beyond what her governess could provide. Lottie wrote a list that filled 3 pages. She included the Latin primer. She included Blackstone. She included Smith. She wrote at the bottom in her clear, steady hand that the finest education she had ever received had cost her nothing but attention, and that the greatest library in England was any room where a woman refused to stop learning. Rowan found her there an hour later, the letter sealed, the candles guttering, her hand resting on the desk beside a volume of parliamentary reports that she had been reading for pleasure, because she was Lottie Sinclair, Duchess of Fenwick, and she read everything she could reach. He sat beside her. He did not speak. He did not need to. The silence between them had long since become a language of its own, fluent, precise, and richer than any letter he had ever written or she had ever found. They arrive here, like a letter left in a pocket, overlooked, patient, waiting for someone with the sense to finally read them.